August 17th, 1944. The grey waters of the English Channel churned beneath the hull of USS Texas as the battleship's gun crews tracked incoming contacts. Lieutenant Commander Robert Sears pressed his eyes against the Mark 37 director, watching three dark specks materialize through the haze at 8,000 yards. Junkers Ju-88 bombers, coming in low and fast, targeting the invasion support fleet anchored off Utah Beach. Sears had commanded this battery for 11 months. He had trained his crews to near perfection in gunnery drills. But he also knew the grim mathematics that governed anti-aircraft fire. With conventional ammunition, his 5-inch 38 guns had perhaps one chance in 2,000 of destroying an attacking aircraft. The odds improved slightly if the target flew straight and level, which no competent pilot would do within range of naval guns. Today, for the first time in combat, every shell in his magazines contained something different. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The new fuses looked identical to the mechanical time fuses his crews had used since commissioning. Same size, same weight, same external appearance, but inside each shell's nose, packed into a space no larger than a pint milk bottle, sat technology that represented 3 years of engineering work, $200 million in development costs, and the coordinated output of over 100 American factories. Sears gave the firing order. 6 guns spoke as one. 6 shells arced upward at 2,600 feet per second. The lead Junkers erupted in flames at 4,000 yards. The pilot never had time to maneuver. One moment his aircraft was boring in on its attack run. The next, it disintegrated under a blast of shrapnel from a shell that exploded 30 feet from his cockpit without making contact. The second aircraft veered hard to starboard, trying to break off. Another shell detonated 25 feet below its wing. The Junkers tumbled into the channel, trailing smoke. The third bomber fled, jettisoning its payload into empty water. Sears allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before his mind began calculating what he had just witnessed. 3 aircraft engaged, 2 destroyed with 12 rounds expended, no hits required. The shells had simply exploded when they got close enough. This represented a fundamental shift in anti-aircraft effectiveness that would alter aerial warfare for the remainder of the war and decades beyond. The story of how American gunners came to possess such capability began not with military innovation, but with a scientific problem that every major power had concluded was impossible to solve. The challenge was as old as aircraft themselves. Since the First World War, when planes first became weapons capable of attacking ground forces and ships, gunners had faced a paradox. Aircraft moved too fast and maneuvered too quickly for direct hits to be reliable. Time-fused shells required perfect prediction of where the target would be 15 to 30 seconds in the future. Even under ideal conditions, with skilled gun crews and advanced fire control systems, the odds of destroying an aircraft remained dismally low. The statistics from early in the war painted a stark picture. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, American ships fired over 1,200 5-inch shells at attacking Japanese aircraft. They achieved 3 confirmed kills. At the Battle of Midway 1 month later, the carriers USS Enterprise and Hornet together fired over 800 rounds of 5-inch ammunition during the initial Japanese strike. They shot down 4 aircraft. The mathematics were unforgiving and consistent across all combatant navies. Destroying a single enemy aircraft required between 1,500 and 3,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition. Some estimates ranged as high as 5,000 rounds per kill under combat conditions, when targets maneuvered aggressively. Each round represented significant cost in materials, manufacturing, and logistics. More critically, each round took time to load, aim, and fire. A gun crew could achieve perhaps 20 rounds per minute under ideal circumstances. Against multiple attacking aircraft, the time required to engage even one target effectively meant other attackers could complete their runs unopposed. The problem was not lack of skill or courage among gun crews. It was fundamental physics combined with mechanical limitations. To detonate a shell near an aircraft required predicting that aircraft's precise position at a specific future moment. Fire control computers, even the most advanced systems available in 1942, performed these calculations based on the target's observed course and speed. But aircraft could change course instantaneously. A pilot who saw shell bursts tracking his approach could simply alter heading or altitude. The predictions became worthless. The shells exploded in empty sky. Traditional mechanical time fuses compounded the problem. These devices, essentially clockwork mechanisms that had evolved slowly since the 19th century, required manual setting before each shot. A sailor used a special wrench to adjust a ring on the fuse body, setting the time delay based on calculations from the fire control computer. Under combat conditions, with aircraft attacking at 300 miles per hour, mistakes were inevitable. Fuses set incorrectly, calculations updated too slowly, shells detonating too early or too late by seconds that translated to hundreds of yards of error. The concept of a proximity fuse, a shell that could detect its own nearness to a target and detonate automatically, had existed in theory since the 1920s. Every major military power had explored the idea. Germany had begun serious research in 1930, developing over 30 different prototype designs. They experimented with acoustic sensors that would trigger on engine noise, with photoelectric cells that would detect shadows, with electrostatic detectors meant to sense the electrical charge around aircraft. By 1939, German engineers had concluded the technical challenges were insurmountable. The devices either lacked sensitivity to reliably detect targets, or were so sensitive they detonated prematurely from environmental factors like rain or clouds. More fundamentally, no design could survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. This creates an acceleration force of 20,000 times normal gravity. For the fraction of a second that the shell travels down the barrel, every component experiences crushing forces equivalent to being struck by a massive hammer. German leadership, focused on technologies that could reach production within 6 months to support operations in Europe, abandoned proximity fuse research in 1940 as too expensive and too uncertain. Limited work resumed in 1944 under engineer Reinhard Borsig, but by then, Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing, and the program produced nothing operational before war's end. The British had reached further. Researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had conceived of using miniature Doppler radar. The principle was elegant. A radio transmitter in the shell's nose would broadcast continuously. As the shell approached a target, the transmitted waves would reflect back. Due to the Doppler effect, the same physics that makes a train whistle's pitch drop as it passes, the frequency of reflected waves would shift. When this frequency shift reached a predetermined level, indicating the target was within lethal range, an electronic circuit would close and detonate the explosive. British scientists built working prototypes using vacuum tube electronics, the only amplifying components available in 1940. They tested these prototypes on unguided rockets, which experienced far less severe acceleration than gun-fired shells. Under ideal conditions, in controlled laboratory tests, the British designs functioned perhaps 50% of the time. For military use, this was wholly inadequate. A weapon that failed half the time was worse than useless. It gave false confidence while consuming resources and potentially causing casualties from premature detonations. Britain faced 2 insurmountable obstacles. First, cost. Each prototype fuse required hand assembly by skilled technicians using expensive miniature components. Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched to breaking point, producing aircraft, ships, tanks, and conventional ammunition. Diverting resources to manufacture an unreliable experimental device made no strategic sense. Second, and more fundamentally, the British could not solve the miniaturization problem. The smallest vacuum tubes available, those developed for hearing aids, were still too large and too fragile. The glass envelopes shattered under shock. The internal filaments snapped, the delicate wire grids deformed. When the TISAD mission shared British technical information with American scientists in 1940, the proximity fuse data came with a pessimistic assessment. The concept was sound, the physics worked, but practical implementation appeared impossible given available technology and manufacturing capabilities. The Americans received this assessment and did something characteristically different. They decided to build it anyway. Not as a laboratory curiosity or limited production weapon, but as a mass-produced munition that could be manufactured by the millions and deployed fleet-wide. The man who made this possible was Dr. Merle Anthony Tuve, a physicist whose brilliance was matched by a volatile temperament and an unwillingness to accept that problems were unsolvable. Born in Canton, South Dakota in 1900, Tuve had earned his doctorate at Johns Hopkins University while pioneering the use of radio waves to study the ionosphere. His work in 1925 with Gregory Bright had laid theoretical foundations for radar. When the National Defense Research Committee approached him in August 1940 about developing a proximity fuse for artillery, Tuve understood immediately that radio physics might provide the solution the British had struggled to achieve. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940 under the direction of Vannevar Bush, brought together America's leading scientific minds. Their mandate was straightforward: identify technologies that could provide military advantage and mobilize American research capacity to develop those technologies for rapid deployment. Tuve's appointment to lead proximity fuse development, designated Section T, reflected both his technical expertise and his reputation for driving projects to completion, regardless of obstacles. Section T began operations on August 24, 1940, with Tuve as chairman and a small team of researchers working in borrowed laboratory space at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Their first task was defining what a working proximity fuse actually required. The specifications seemed designed to be impossible. The device had to fit inside the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, leaving room for 7 pounds of high explosive. Inside this space, no larger than a pint milk bottle, engineers had to pack a complete radio transmitter, a receiver, electronic amplifiers, frequency comparison circuits, a power source, safety mechanisms, and a detonator. All components had to function after being stored for months in various climates, from tropical heat to Arctic cold. The electronics had to survive being fired from a gun at forces that would turn a 1-ounce component into the equivalent of 1,250 pounds for a split second. The shell would spin at 25,000 revolutions per minute as rifling imparted stabilizing rotation. After enduring this violence, the delicate circuits had to power up immediately, function perfectly during perhaps 10 seconds of flight time, detect a target, compute proximity, and fire a detonator with split-second timing. The first major obstacle was vacuum tubes. In 1940, these glass envelopes containing heated filaments and metal grids were the only electronic components capable of amplifying signals. Every radio, every piece of electronic equipment, relied on vacuum tubes. The smallest tubes available, those used in hearing aids, stood perhaps 2 inches tall and weighed a fraction of an ounce. They were designed for the gentle environment of sitting in someone's pocket, powered by small batteries, amplifying the weak signals from microphones. They were not designed for war. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined Section T in April 1942, faced the task of creating what the team called ruggedized vacuum tubes. Van Allen would later become famous for discovering the radiation belts around Earth that bear his name. In 1942, he spent his days destroying vacuum tubes by firing them from guns to understand exactly how and why they failed. The Applied Physics Laboratory, established on March 10, 1942, and housed initially in a rented Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, became the center of this work. Van Allen started with miniature tubes from Raytheon and Sylvania, companies that manufactured hearing aid components. Working with their engineers, he redesigned tubes from first principles. The glass envelopes were thickened to resist shattering. The annealing process was refined to eliminate internal stresses. The filaments, thin wires that glowed when heated to emit electrons, were redesigned with shorter unsupported spans and heavier cross-sections to resist braking under acceleration. The metal grids that controlled electron flow were strengthened and precisely positioned. Every dimension was calculated to survive forces that seemed designed to destroy electronic equipment. Testing proceeded systematically. Complete fuses were fired from a vertical test gun at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia. The gun aimed straight down into soft earth that caught the shells gently enough that researchers could recover them intact. Each fuse was then disassembled and examined under microscopes. Engineers photographed broken filaments, measured deformed grids, documented shattered glass. Each failure taught specific lessons about what needed strengthening and how. Through hundreds of test firings and thousands of design iterations, reliability slowly improved. By September 1941, success rates had climbed above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness against Japanese expansion in the Pacific, made a decision that would prove crucial. They accepted a 50% reliability rate and authorized tooling for mass production. The engineers were confident they could improve reliability during the production ramp-up. They were correct. By early 1943, reliability exceeded 90%. By late 1944, it approached 95%. But vacuum tubes were only one challenge among many. The fuse required a power source. Conventional batteries of the era were too large and too heavy. Section T engineers developed a specialized battery using a reserve electrolyte design. The battery remained inert during storage. When the shell was fired, acceleration forced liquid electrolyte into contact with the electrodes, activating the battery. This solved both shelf life and safety concerns. The battery could not power the fuse until the shell was actually fired, preventing accidental detonation during handling or storage. The radio circuit presented its own obstacles. The transmitter had to operate at frequencies high enough that Doppler shift would be measurable, approximately 180 to 220 MHz. At these frequencies, circuit design became critical. The wavelength of the transmitted signal was only about 5 feet. Components had to be precisely sized and positioned. Small variations in manufacture would shift the operating frequency enough to cause malfunctions. The receiver had to detect reflected signals, perhaps 1/10,000th the strength of the transmitted signal. It had to discriminate between legitimate target reflections and spurious signals from rain, clouds, or the ground passing below. The detonation circuit required fail-safe design. The fuse had to remain absolutely safe during handling, loading, and the first fraction of a second of flight. Premature detonation inside a gun barrel would kill the entire gun crew and potentially detonate other ammunition in the magazine. Section T engineers developed multiple safety mechanisms. A mechanical arming pin that prevented the detonator from receiving current until centrifugal force from the shell's rotation pulled it clear. An electronic timer that kept circuits inactive for the first few seconds of flight. A self-destruct mechanism that detonated the shell if it failed to hit a target and began descending, preventing unexploded ammunition from falling on friendly forces. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Every component required new manufacturing techniques. The vacuum tubes needed specialized glass formulations and precisely controlled annealing. The electronic circuits required components manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The tiny batteries needed exotic chemicals and careful assembly. Nothing could be made using existing production methods. Everything required developing new processes, training new workers, establishing new quality control procedures. The scale of the industrial challenge matched the technical challenge. The Applied Physics Laboratory grew from a handful of researchers in 1940 to over 1,000 scientists and engineers by 1943. But the laboratory only designed the fuses. Actually manufacturing them required mobilizing American industry on unprecedented scale. Over 100 companies participated in proximity fuse production. Some made vacuum tubes. Others manufactured batteries, electronic components, mechanical parts, or explosive charges. Every company had to meet identical specifications. A tube from one manufacturer had to function identically to a tube from another. Components from dozens of suppliers had to mate perfectly during final assembly. The organization required was staggering. Eastman Kodak, a company known for cameras and film, began manufacturing fuse components using their expertise in precision optical and mechanical assembly. Raytheon and Sylvania expanded vacuum tube production beyond anything they had imagined possible. Smaller companies that had never made military equipment learned to produce components to specifications more demanding than peacetime commercial products. Worker training became critical. The fuses required assembly precision beyond most manufacturing of the era. Women, entering the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers as men left for military service, became the primary assembly workers. They learned to handle miniature components, to solder connections that could not vary by more than a few thousandths of an inch, to test circuits with specialized equipment. Training programs emphasized that each fuse they assembled would protect American sailors and airmen. The work was tedious, demanding absolute concentration, but workers understood its importance. Quality control procedures were ruthless. Every fuse was tested multiple times during assembly. Electronic circuits were checked at each stage. Completed fuses underwent function tests that simulated flight conditions. Any fuse that failed any test was scrapped entirely, its components salvaged if possible, but the unit never assembled or shipped. The failure rate in manufacturing was deliberately high. Better to reject a fuse in the factory than have it fail in combat, or worse, detonate prematurely and kill American gun crews. By mid-1943, production reached scale. Factories were manufacturing over 20,000 fuses per day. By 1944, daily production exceeded 70,000 units. The total number of proximity fuses manufactured during the war would reach 22 million rounds. Each fuse contained approximately 130 precision components. The mathematics of this production achievement are staggering. 22 million fuses, each with 130 components, meant nearly 3 billion individual parts manufactured to demanding specifications, assembled by hand, tested rigorously, packaged for shipment across oceans to combat zones worldwide. The cost per fuse dropped from $732 in 1942, when production was experimental and volumes were tiny, to $18 by 1945, as manufacturing techniques improved and economies of scale took effect. At $18 per round, the fuses cost less than half what a standard 5-inch projectile cost. The explosive efficiency alone justified the price, but the true value lay in combat effectiveness. The question facing military planners in early 1943 was whether this technological achievement would translate to battlefield results. Laboratory tests proved the fuses worked. Test firings at ranges demonstrated they could detect and detonate near-target drones, but combat conditions were different. Would the fuses survive shipment to forward areas? Would they function reliably when stored in ships' magazines for weeks in tropical heat or Arctic cold? Would they detonate prematurely from radar signals, radio transmissions, or other electromagnetic interference common in combat zones? Most critically, would they actually destroy significantly more aircraft than conventional ammunition? The Navy decided to introduce proximity fuses gradually, beginning in the Pacific where security could be maintained. The first combat use came in January 1943, exactly as described in Lieutenant Commander Cochrane's action aboard USS Helena in the Solomon Islands. The results were immediate and dramatic. Ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition began destroying attacking aircraft at rates that seemed impossible. Instead of requiring 2,000 rounds per kill, proximity fuses achieved kills with an average of approximately 300 rounds expended. Some engagements saw even better performance. The transformation in anti-aircraft effectiveness became undeniable during the kamikaze campaigns of 1944 and 1945. Japanese suicide attacks, beginning systematically in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, represented a fundamental shift in aerial warfare. Traditional defensive calculations no longer applied when the attacking pilot intended to crash into his target regardless of damage. A conventional aircraft might break off an attack when hit by defensive fire. A kamikaze would continue as long as the pilot remained conscious and the aircraft had any control authority. Against this threat, proximity fuses proved devastatingly effective. The statistics from major naval engagements tell the story. During the Okinawa campaign, from April through June 1945, Japanese aircraft launched over 1,500 kamikaze sorties against American ships. The Fifth Fleet, centered around fast carriers and supported by cruisers and destroyers, fired over 6 million rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition during the 3-month campaign. They destroyed approximately 55% of attacking kamikazes before impact. Without proximity fuses, using conventional time-fused ammunition, historical experience suggested they might have destroyed 20 to 25% of attackers. The difference represented hundreds of aircraft destroyed that would otherwise have struck ships. Each kamikaze that reached its target typically killed or wounded dozens of sailors, damaged or sank a ship, representing months of construction and millions of dollars of resources. The proximity fuse did not make American ships invulnerable. Japanese kamikazes sank 36 ships during the Okinawa campaign and damaged over 300 more. But without proximity fuses, casualties would have been catastrophically higher. Some estimates suggest ship losses might have doubled or tripled, with corresponding increases in casualties. The effectiveness manifested in specific engagements where individual ships faced concentrated attacks. On April 6, 1945, during the first major kamikaze operation against the Okinawa invasion fleet, the destroyer USS Newcomb came under attack by multiple aircraft. Her 5-inch guns, firing proximity-fused ammunition, destroyed 3 attackers before they could crash the ship. 2 more aircraft struck Newcomb, causing severe damage, but the ship survived. Her gun crews estimated they had fired fewer than 200 rounds to achieve 3 kills. With conventional ammunition, they likely would have achieved 0 kills while expending similar ammunition quantities. Those 3 aircraft not destroyed would have joined the 2 that did hit, potentially sinking the destroyer outright. The combat reports from Okinawa consistently showed proximity fuses achieving kill rates between 5 and 7 times better than conventional ammunition. A typical engagement might see a ship fire 50 to 75 rounds to destroy an attacker. Before proximity fuses, the same ship might fire 200 to 300 rounds with no guarantee of success. The improvement factor varied depending on conditions. Against targets flying straight and level at high altitude, proximity fuses showed less dramatic advantage because conventional time-fused fire could be effective. Against maneuvering targets at low altitude, the advantage became overwhelming. Proximity fuses could destroy aircraft that conventional fire had virtually no chance of hitting. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrews was significant, though difficult to quantify. Pilots who survived proximity fuse encounters and returned to base reported that American anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate. They described shells that seemed to track aircraft, that exploded precisely when they passed nearby regardless of evasive maneuvers. Some pilots believed Americans had developed radar-guided shells, a technology actually beyond even American capabilities in 1945. The reality that individual shells carried their own sensing and detonation systems seemed too advanced to be credible. Japanese intelligence efforts to understand the new American capability failed completely. Several proximity-fused shells were recovered from combat zones when they failed to detonate. Japanese bomb disposal teams carefully examined these duds, but the security measures built into the fuses prevented useful analysis. When a fuse failed to detonate normally, a secondary self-destruct mechanism would eventually trigger, destroying the fuse body and all internal components. The few fuses captured before self-destruct activated were damaged enough that their operating principles remained unclear. German forces, facing proximity fuses primarily in the European theatre during 1944 and 45, had slightly better intelligence. They recovered several intact fuses from shells that landed in soft ground without detonating. German engineers examined these examples with growing disbelief. The The miniaturized vacuum tubes violated everything they understood about what was possible in electronics manufacture. The rugged construction suggested American manufacturing capabilities far beyond what German intelligence had estimated. Most disturbing was the implication about American industrial capacity. These were not hand-built prototypes. They were mass-produced weapons being expended freely in combat. German analysts calculated that Americans were manufacturing proximity fuses at rates exceeding 50,000 per day. The electronics industry required to support such production would dwarf Germany's entire vacuum tube manufacturing capacity. This suggested American industrial superiority, not just in scale, but in technical sophistication. Germany had concentrated industrial resources on producing jet aircraft, V-2 rockets, and other advanced weapons in limited quantities. Americans were producing equally sophisticated weapons in quantities that defied German comprehension. The strategic implications extended beyond individual engagements. Proximity fuses changed tactical calculations for both attackers and defenders. American ships could sail with greater confidence that they could defend against aerial attack. Task force commanders deployed ships more aggressively, knowing that defensive capabilities had improved dramatically. The fast carrier task forces that struck Japanese positions throughout the Pacific in 1944 and 45 operated with reduced screening forces because individual ships could defend themselves more effectively. For Japanese and German air forces, proximity fuses made attacks on American ships or formations increasingly suicidal. Even skilled pilots with good aircraft faced defensive fire that required perfect luck to survive. Attack aircraft losses mounted steadily. Japan, already facing critical shortages of trained pilots by mid-1944, could not replace losses at the rate proximity fuses inflicted them. The decision to resort to kamikaze tactics reflected partly this reality. If attacking aircraft were going to be destroyed anyway, at least suicide attacks guaranteed some value from their loss if they reached targets. The technology influenced post-war military development profoundly. The miniaturization techniques developed for proximity fuses became foundational for the entire electronics industry. The quality control methods established manufacturing standards that spread throughout American industry. The workforce training programs demonstrated that complex technical work could be performed by people without advanced education given proper instruction and supervision. These organizational and technical innovations shaped American industrial development for decades. The scientists and engineers who worked on proximity fuses went on to distinguished careers. James Van Allen became one of the founding figures of space science, leading experiments on early satellites that discovered Earth's radiation belts. Merle Tuve returned to Carnegie Institution, rarely speaking publicly about his wartime work, but recognized by those who knew the program as the man whose leadership made proximity fuses possible. Dozens of other researchers joined universities, industrial laboratories, and government facilities, bringing expertise in miniaturization, electronics, and systems engineering. The intellectual capital developed during the proximity fuse program helped establish American leadership in electronics throughout the second half of the 20th century. The transistor, invented at Bell Laboratories in 1947, built on vacuum tube miniaturization techniques. The integrated circuit, developed in the 1950s, applied lessons about mass-producing complex electronic assemblies. The space program, particularly the development of guidance systems for rockets and satellites, drew directly on knowledge gained, making electronics survive extreme environments. Modern smart weapons that carry sensors, processors, and communication systems trace their lineage directly to those first proximity fuses, manufactured in 1943. The industrial infrastructure created for fuse production found new uses after the war. Factories that had manufactured vacuum tubes converted to producing television tubes as commercial broadcasting expanded in the 1950s. Workers trained in precision assembly became the workforce for consumer electronics industries. Supply chains established for proximity fuse components supported the growth of commercial markets for radios, televisions, and eventually computers. The organizational knowledge about how to manufacture millions of complex items to demanding specifications became embedded in American industrial culture. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal stated after the war that the proximity fuse had blazed the trail to Japan, noting that without the protection this device provided surface ships, the advance across the Pacific could not have been so swift, and the cost in lives and vessels would have been immeasurably greater. This assessment, from a leader with access to all combat data and strategic analysis, reflected the military establishment's understanding of the fuse's importance. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitcher commanding fast carrier task forces, recalled that all 5-inch ammunition used in 1945 was fitted with proximity fuses, and those fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens, preventing ship losses that would have been enormously larger. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in his post-war memoirs, noted that proximity fuses manufactured in the United States proved potent against Vone flying bombs that assaulted Britain in 1944. British anti-aircraft batteries, equipped with American-made proximity-fused ammunition, achieved kill rates against V-1s far exceeding what conventional ammunition could accomplish. The flying bombs, essentially pilotless jet-powered aircraft, flew too fast and too low for time-fused shells to be effective. Proximity fuses transformed British air defence effectiveness at a critical moment when Vone attacks threatened civilian morale and military operations. The human cost of proximity fuse development deserves acknowledgement. Several researchers died during testing when experimental fuses detonated prematurely. Factory workers suffered injuries from handling explosive components. The pressure to develop and manufacture the fuses on compressed timelines led to long hours and exhausting conditions. But these sacrifices paled compared to the lives saved by the technology's deployment. Every ship that survived a kamikaze attack because proximity fuses destroyed the attacker represented dozens of sailors who came home. Every bomber that returned from a mission because German anti-aircraft fire was less effective meant 10 crew members survived. The mathematical precision of the improvement remains striking even decades later. Before proximity fuses, anti-aircraft fire achieved approximately 1 kill per 2,000 rounds fired under combat conditions. After proximity fuses were widely deployed, that figure improved to approximately 1 kill per 300 to 400 rounds. The improvement factor of 5 to 7 times translated directly to the 70% increase in effectiveness referenced in combat reports. Ships that might have destroyed 30% of attackers with conventional ammunition destroyed 70% or more with proximity fuses under identical conditions. This effectiveness gain resulted from eliminating the fundamental weakness of time-fused ammunition. No longer did shells require perfect prediction of target position. Proximity fuses compensated for errors in fire control solutions. They destroyed maneuvering targets as readily as those flying straight and level. They worked at night, when visual ranging was difficult. They functioned through clouds and smoke that obscured targets from optical directors. The fuses gave American gun crews a weapon that minimized human error and maximized the explosive effect of each round fired. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately about solving problems through application of scientific method, industrial capacity, and determination. The Germans had concluded it was impossible. The British had achieved laboratory prototypes but could not manufacture them at scale. The Americans decided impossible simply meant no one had succeeded yet. They assembled the scientific talent to understand the physics. They mobilized the industrial capacity to manufacture millions of units. They developed quality control methods to ensure reliability. They created training programs to teach workers complex assembly procedures. They established logistics systems to deliver ammunition across the world's oceans to combat fleets. Every aspect of this achievement reflected uniquely American strengths. The scientific establishment, centered in universities and private laboratories, provided intellectual resources. The industrial base, unmatched in scale and sophistication, provided manufacturing capability. The population, educated and adaptable, provided skilled labor. The government, willing to invest massive resources in speculative technologies, provided funding and coordination. The military, pragmatic and result-oriented, provided clear requirements and rapid feedback from combat use. The proximity fuse proved that free societies, when threatened, can achieve technological miracles. The weapon that seemed impossible in 1940 was being produced at 70,000 per day by 1945. The electronics that experts said could never survive gun launch were functioning at 95% reliability. The cost that began at over $700 per unit dropped to $18 through manufacturing improvements. American scientists, engineers, workers, and sailors had accomplished what the world's experts declared could not be done. Lieutenant Commander Robert Sears, watching those Junkers bombers disintegrate over the English Channel in August 1944, understood implicitly that something fundamental had changed in aerial warfare. His gun crews had destroyed aircraft without perfect aim, without precise target prediction, without any of the complex calculations that had limited anti-aircraft effectiveness for decades. The shells had done the work, sensing targets, timing their own detonations, achieving what human gunners could only approximate through extraordinary skill and luck. In that moment, off Utah Beach, the future of warfare had arrived. Individual munitions carried sufficient intelligence to make autonomous decisions about when to detonate. This principle, established with vacuum tubes and miniature batteries in 1943, would evolve through decades of refinement into the smart weapons of the 21st century. But the foundation was laid by researchers like Merle Tuve and James Van Allen, by factory workers assembling components to impossible tolerances, by sailors who loaded and fired shells that embodied the highest technology their civilization could produce. The proximity fuse stands as testament to what can be achieved when scientific curiosity, industrial might, and strategic necessity align in pursuit of a worthy goal. It saved thousands of American lives by making the ships that carried soldiers across oceans more likely to survive the crossing. It shortened the war by making aerial attacks increasingly futile, forcing enemies to expend resources on tactics with diminishing returns. It demonstrated that victory comes not from seeking miracle weapons, but from making necessary weapons work better through sustained effort and unlimited application of resources. The German soldiers who witnessed proximity-fused artillery bursts, the Japanese pilots who died without understanding what killed them, the British civilians protected from Vone bombs, all faced the same reality. American gunners had started using VT fuses, and those fuses were shooting down 70% more enemy planes than conventional ammunition ever could. This improvement, achieved through brilliant science and industrial determination, altered the course of the war and established principles that continue shaping warfare 8 decades later. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.